Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal. I've been playing a bunch of different class specs over in the Midnight Beta, trying out as many different talents, as many different playstyle options as possible, and just experimenting with as many different class changes that we've seen so far over the past few weeks. And I've noticed that mages continue to be one of the more dominant specs in every single dungeon that I jump into. Whether I'm playing Hunter or Rogue or testing out the Demon Hunter spec, I always see a mage in just about every single group that I sign up to. And the amount of damage this class could do is out of this world. It's always possible that the spec is just absolutely overtuned, but I feel like every other class that was overtuned, like Rogues for instance, who got slapped down pretty hard with a bunch of nerfs this week specifically. But Frost mages haven't been touched at all, and unless Blizzard does some huge nerfs for this spec, this may be one of those specs that you may want to consider heading into Midnight. They're so incredibly fun to play. The changes that they did to the whole shatter and freezing mechanics standardize the spec so well, and the fact that they no longer have a major cooldown, but instead the spec just does damage, high amounts of damage at all times, is actually just so enjoyable to play. And I think this fits Frost Mage much better than it has over these past few expansions. And since I've been spending a lot of time with mages, I thought I should just do a mage overview of everything we've seen so far in the beta. So I'm going to go over all the specs, all the hero specs, and primarily highlight why I've been enjoying and loving Frost Mage so much, and why it might actually be my go-to favorite ult heading into Midnight. With that being said, if you guys want to see more regular Midnight class updates, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. But otherwise, let's dive right in. So while I primarily want to talk about the mage, specifically Frost Mage, and why it's doing so good on the beta, I do want to go over all of the other changes for mages as well, starting with some of the new hero talent changes and kind of doing a bit of an overview of everything new that has happened. Starting things off, I mean, the Frostfire spec, it's a little bug right now, like Isothermic Core, which is where whenever you send your Comet Storm or Fireball, you get the other, depending on your spec. It's a little bugged, because technically I have the right talent for it, which is Comet Storm, but it looks so, like, red out, like I don't have it. It's a little bit confusing on the beta, but it does work. Like, you have to log out, log in, and if you're in the beta and you've seen it red out and it's not sending out your Comet Storm or your Meteor as Fire or Frost, log out, log in, and that should fix itself. Hopefully. For some players that worked, but not for everybody apparently. Frostfire for the most part didn't really change too much. This week they are reducing the image of the Frostfire bolt quite a decent bit by 30%, which might just be like a tuning thing for Frostfire Frost mages, which seems to be a very popular choice. Maybe they're trying to make Spellslinger a little bit better. Although they did reduce the cast speed of Frostfire Bolt, so you do fire them off very quickly. But with how many procs you get right now in the beta, I don't even know if I'm really standing still and like really casting a lot of these all that often. They did also take the Frost version of the dual casting adept and add a shatter bonus, which is huge for Frost in particular. I will talk about why Frost or shatter mechanic is really cool and actually really did enjoy it so far in the beta and why it's so strong. But that is something to note. They're basically trying to make shatter super good, and that's very noticeable this week specifically. And I think they did is try to make Spellslinger play a little bit better. I don't see a lot of players usually like pop into a dungeon, you know, key after key, testing after testing. Not a lot of players are really giving Spellslinger a go, but they did try to make it better. They changed up the capstone, they also gave him more resource generation for splinters, and reduced the need for you to track so many different splinters to maximize your damage. Splinters themselves is something that you generate through basic abilities, and it's something that deals instant damage. It's no longer a dot and a thing you need to track, and then, you know, watching out how many splinters you have, so you try to spread it to targets. It just does instant damage to a foe. You can also randomly generate a bunch of them with the Augury Abounds, so it's like a 10% chance to just get 8 of them. A little bit of RNG for mages, which is, I don't know, some people like RNG, some people don't. I don't always do it unless I play Outlaw. You can also get more procs like Killer Casting or Brain Freeze with Archmage's Wrath, so it's also pretty cool. And now Splinter Storm gives you a little bit more control when it comes to your burst, and now it works off of your major burst abilities like Ray of Frost or Arcane Surge in order to give you a little bit more output. Usually this is like something that just kind of can happen randomly and sometimes has effect during burst, but they wanted to make sure that you feel powerful during your big burst windows. For the most part, Spellslinger is still passive. There are a couple of cool talents and synergies to add in here that could work for certain builds, but yeah, it didn't change too much compared to like the War Within version. From there, we got goodies all around with Fire Mages. They got their ability of Scorch back. For some reason, Blizzard thought for Midnight they're going to do a bunch of class simplifications, and Fire Mages are just going to stand still and Fireball everywhere they go. And Scorch wasn't even an ability. It was just something that buffed up your Fireballs when enemies are low on health. I heard the community. I heard a lot of people scream out in unison, Scorch has returned. So if you need an ability, just something that you can cast on the move, or when an enemy is super low on health, you can now use Scorch, which is baseline. You can also pick up Scald, however, where Fireball always crits enemies that are 30% health. Both Fireball and Scorch will deal damage, so like, you got that big execute window, Scorching on the move, Fireballing when you can stand still. But if you're constantly going to be moving, just picking up Scorch with additional like guaranteed crits at low health targets is going to be fine as an ability by itself. So that's really, really good to see. And it's also really good for mages when it comes to like PvP and things like that. They're also trying to make the ability of Meteor a lot better. Not only did the buff its damage by like 30%, the town below it called Deep Impact, now the enemy that stays closest to the center, so either if like a pack of enemies and whoever's in the center is going to take more damage, or if it's just one enemy, as long as they get hit by Meteor, they just take 75% more damage. So they're trying to make this one as good as possible. They also changed it so the Meteor no longer has this like long-lasting burn. Now, the actual burn effect after it lands is only 4 seconds. So previously it was like an 8-second ground burn, now it's 4. They buffed the damage of that burn so you can get all of its value in a shorter window. Like, let's say you're doing a boss fight and you drop a Meteor and then the tech needs to immediately move the boss. If, let's say, they're walking out of it while the burn is on the ground, that's just wasted damage. But now that it's only 4 seconds, if the enemy even stands like 3 seconds, you did like majority of your damage in that burn window. So yeah, they're trying to make Meteor just as good as possible as an ability, which is good to see. Lastly, they did also reduce the cast time of Fireball, so you now can fire them off a little bit more rapidly. Previously, a lot of players commented that it felt like Fireball was just like, it felt like you were casting a Pyroblast with how long you were firing them off. So now it feels a little bit better. Now it just has a bit better flow for the Mage. It is nice overall. It doesn't necessarily fix any of the big issues with fire at all, but at least it's a good step in the right direction. Another spec that saw a lot of buffs is Arcane Mage, which seems to be a little bit weaker on the weaker side when it comes to Midnight Beta. Like, when you look at the logs, like a lot of the times when I'm trying to research how to play a class or research some of the changes or even try some of the different talents, I go to players that actually play these classes, unlock logs and stuff. There I can pick up the talents, see what type of builds they are, see what hero specs seem to be popular, and I can usually use that to compare against other players to find trends, which talents and builds work and which ones don't. And I unfortunately don't see a lot of Arcane Mage logs when it comes to Mythic Plus. And there's a ton of logs, there's a lot of people playing, there's a ton of variety, but when it comes to Arcane Mages, there's like a handful of them. So Arcane Mages is a spec that I haven't seen a lot on beta whatsoever. So possibly it's something that they're just like undertuned. They're just not really getting a lot of content play, at least when it comes to dungeon content. They have been essentially buffed up this week quite a decent bit, where majority of the damage abilities have been boosted. Things like Arcane Blast, Arcane Pulse, which is like the new version. It's like an AoE version of an Arcane Blast that replaces Arcane Explosion, which is kind of cool. Arcane Surge, Arcane Orb, Arcane Missiles, all buffed up by 20%. And the Arcane Barrage ability got buffed up by 40%. So basically just buffs all across the board, and even with those buffs, I haven't really seen a lot of players diving into Arcane that much. Initially, I thought the spec was going to have a lot of cool like synergy, because there's a lot of fun talents they added. They simplified the spec like every other spec in the game, but then they added a cool talent called Orb Mastery, where Arcane Orbs can consume clear casting procs, and when it does that, it fires off a bunch of Arcane Orbs that are targeted at 100% effectiveness, so you can get like a train of orbs just firing off back to back if you're getting a bunch of Arcane clear casting procs. And to me, it looked like Arcane Mages definitely had a lot of potential, as they are one of my favorite specs to play from War Within. And even when they're not that great, Arcane is something I normally have gravitated to and I've loved. But it doesn't really look like they're getting a lot of play in Midnight, and they may need a little bit more work. So if you check them out in beta and the damage seems a little bit lower, it's just something that Arcane is going through and seems to be going through a bit of a rough pass. However, I think a lot of players are going to be picking up Mage in Midnight for Frost specifically. Arcane, Fire, all are fun, but Frost seems to be doing super well week after week so far. It is incredibly strong, but specifically because they changed the way that they play. No longer the spec has any kind of like major cooldown like Icy Veins, and instead it just plays around like shorter minute CD, 1 minute at most when it comes to abilities like your Frozen Orb, or abilities like your Ray of Frost, which is now your major new combat burst ability. But you don't necessarily play around like a damage burst window, you just gotta do high damage at all times, and you have a handful of hard-hitting abilities that you use every minute at most. Now what's changed for Frost Mages for the most part is a mechanic called Freezing and Shattering. So some of your abilities are going to build up a buff called Freezing, and it stacks up. And then certain abilities, primarily Ice Lance, will consume it to shatter those stacks in order to deal immediate damage. In most cases, majority of the abilities that will spend stacks of freezing will be things like your Ice Lance, but also if you press Ray of Frost and you talent it into Comet Storm, After spamming Ray of Frost, you can also then Comet Storm, and each one of the comets will also consume the stacks of Shatter as well. And it does a lot of damage. I mean, Shatter is a huge hitter, especially when it comes to dungeons. It's not the craziest damage ability, but it's something that is kind of prevalent at all times, whether you're fighting a single foe, a couple of enemies, or a bunch of enemies in AoE. And of course, your big damage abilities like your Frozen Orb, bunch of Blizzards, and a Ray of Frost together with Comet Storm is going to do a lot of damage, and even Flash Freeze Burn is going to do a lot. But Shatter is someone that is consistent and lingers there in all situations, and ends up kind of reinforcing a lot of your overall damage. You even give him a new mastery that buffs up further, spells that freeze the enemy deal more damage, and spells that shatter the enemy also deals more damage. So that's a little bit more consistent. So as long as you're using abilities that can apply freezing to the target, or can shatter those stacks of freezing, then you can basically stack as much mastery as you want, with mastery becoming a much better and more consistent of a stat. A couple of cool things that changed from Mage 2 is Glacial Spike. It is now something that is just, it's something that you catalyze over time. Over time, you just, in combat, you generate stacks of icicles, and then your next Frostbolt becomes a Glacial Spike. It just replaces it completely, which is really cool. Normally, Glacial Spike applies 3 stacks of freezing, but there's also a couple other talents like Glacial Chill, where it now deals some more damage and applies a few more stacks of freezing, or instead you can have it so instead of applying freezing, it just consumes and those stacks of freezing, shattering 5 of them at a time. So I've actually been playing with Glacial Shatter, and I kind of like it. I think it helps push that shatter damage a little bit far forward. So I can either shatter it through lances, or if I'm saving it for like a big Comet Storm or a Glacial Spike, that's also another way that I can, you know, consume and cash in on my shatters very, very quickly. And I like the flow. I think it actually gives pretty good feel for Frost Mage in general. Also, cool stuff is back, like Water Elemental. So there's a portion of the Mage community that always wanted to play with the Water Elemental, and ever since they removed this thing out of the game, they wanted it to be back, like as a pet that you summon and you fight with at all times. It's like a mechanic that mages have had back in like Warcraft 3, where Antonight is summoning Water Elementals to his sides. You just always have a Water Ellie buddy. They're kind of useful. They do a little bit of damage, and they can also freeze enemies in place, which is also pretty cool. Definitely useful in things like PvP, for instance. They hit enemy with a water jet that deals some damage over time, and then they water bolt for additional damage as well. It's not the craziest damage, but I think they found a decent way to maybe try to like make the two talents, two abilities just a little bit more even. You can run with a Water Elemental, or you can play someone like Lonely Winter if you just don't want to have a pet. 3% more damage you do, or Elemental. I don't know if the Elemental actually makes up the difference that Lonely Winter provides. I don't know which one of those two is stronger, but they could possibly tune it so they're not that far away from one another. Although I feel like Lonely Winter is probably going to be overall better in AoE content, because spell damage will apply for things like your Frozen Orb, for things like your Blizzards, and the Water Elemental can't really AoE. It'll probably be okay in single target and maybe good in PvP for this utility for crowd control, but I don't really know if it's going to be that much better in AoE, but it's only a 3% difference. Previously, I think Lonely Winter used to be like 10, if not 15% more damage, but like 3% seems like a small enough number. And what's cool is there's actually some synergies with Water Elemental as they actually try to integrate it into Spellslinger. If you pick up Attuned Familiar, which is available for both Arcane and Frost, your Elemental, your Familiar, can actually now generate you Splinters, so potentially a Spellslinger you might be running with a Water Elemental. I just think it's really cool. I think it's something that the community wanted just as a utility thing, and I just think it's really, really neat. So far, I've just been playing Lonely Winter, but if you want to run with Water Ellie, I don't think it'll be the worst move heading forward. Outside of this, a lot of the changes the Frost Mages have been focusing on is adding even more talents in order to play around with this whole freezing shatter mechanic. Things like Thermal Void, where consuming Brain Freeze procs now causes you next Ice Lance, which is like your primary way that you shatter stacks of freezing, to shatter 5 additional stacks, to try to give lances in particular like more ways to them to be relevant within day-to-day gameplay. So you can either have them be more efficient, or clean multiple targets, or prioritize enemies with the shatter and do AoE damage with those shatters. And there's some really cool stuff they're doing with lances. So if you try to go for like a more insta-casting build, I think there's an opportunity for mages going forward, especially if you're somebody who maybe like PvPs, for instance. So potentially it could be really, really good for this spec, and it does seem like they're getting quite a varied level of abilities and talents to pick from in order to really inch out some of the most fun builds available. And the damage of this spec has been really, really good. Like, it's actually somewhat incredible to see just how much output it does. It feels like it's the most consistent, easy to pick up alt when it comes to just jumping into a dungeon within Midnight Beta, and might potentially be the go-to alt for me and so many others, as it's been performing incredibly well. Now, beta performance and things is just something to take very, very lightly. Don't definitely take it with like the tiniest grain of salt. But when we're seeing certain specs like performing again and again, like at the top end, and pushing some of the more harder content, unless Blizzard goes and just like absolutely guts them with some absolutely disastrous nerfs, likely chance that our Frost Mages will continue to be a very, very popular pick and a very strong option heading forward. Again, unless Blizzard does some huge changes in order to completely rip out their essence and really nerf them down by quite a decent bit. But with that being said, as always, I do want to thank all of you guys so much for watching and hope you guys did enjoy the video. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give it a like, as it would very much appreciate it. Also, be sure to join our Discord community, especially if you just want to keep up with any new updates regarding Midnight Beta when it comes to new builds or new class changes, or if, let's say, certain specs starts to, let's say, come out on top when it comes to Raid or Mythic Plus testing. Also, be sure to let me know your thoughts on what you think about Frost Mages in the comments below, and if you're planning on playing one either as a main or as an alt going forward. And as always, I'll see all of you guys in the next one.